Welcome back to my channel, and a special thank you to my subscribers, all 16 of you. Today I want to discuss one of the essential skills model railroaders need, that is soldering. Soldering is pretty easy if you have the right tools, but it can be incredibly frustrating if you do not. So let's dive right in. You only need 3 tools, but they are all essential. First, you need a good soldering station, which allows you to control the temperature of your soldering iron. This particular soldering station includes a metal holder for the hot iron, a temperature control dial, and a receptacle which holds a damp sponge. A 40-watt station is perfectly adequate. Get an iron with a pencil tip as shown here. You do not need temperature indication. A simple rheostat as shown here is just fine. Second, you will need a good set of wire strippers. These strippers will remove the insulation from wire ranging from 32 gauge to 22 gauge. This will cover most of your soldering needs. Buy a good pair of strippers. A cheap pair will cause you nothing but aggravation. Third, you will need a good multimeter. Try to get one with nice sharp tips. That will allow you to read voltages in pretty tight spaces. Okay, you really don't need a multimeter for soldering. You'll need a multimeter to find out where you've made a mistake. You'll use that multimeter to test electrical connectivity and voltage. You should be able to get all of these tools for less than $100 total. Next, you will need a few supplies. First is soldering flux. I prefer the gel flux, shown here, but others prefer paste flux. Flux is cheap. Try both kinds and use the one you prefer. Second, you'll need a supply of rosin core solder. This solder is 0.8 millimeters in diameter, but you can buy solder in a variety of different sizes. Third, you'll need something to apply flux. I use these micro brushes. They work for flux, also for glue, paint, and many other applications, so I buy them by the hundred. If you used paste flux, I suggest applying the flux with a wooden toothpick. Fourth, you'll need a supply of heat shrink tubing. Heat shrink tubing serves 2 important purposes. It electrically insulates the solder joints, and it covers up your ugly solder joints. Heat shrink tubing comes in various sizes. I suggest 3/64 inch, 16th inch, and 1/8 inch diameters. Heat shrink tubing will shrink to a little less than 1/2 its diameter. You can buy a 100-foot spool of heat shrink tubing for about $18, or you can buy a size assortment, which contains sizes you'll never need, containing about 50 feet total for about $15. Finally, you'll need a supply of wire. I suggest stranded wire. To start, you should have some 30 gauge and some 24 gauge wire in at least 2 insulation colors each. Now let's start soldering. First, turn on your soldering station. I have mine set to 2.5, which is just right to melt the solder. You should also wet the sponge that sits in the tray. The sponge does not need to be dripping wet, but it should be thoroughly wet. When you're ready to apply solder, pick up the iron, wipe any excess solder and old flux off the tip using the wet sponge, then touch the soldering tip to the end of your spool of solder. A small blob of molten solder will adhere to the iron and remain there ready for your use. With everything in place, soldering is quite simple. Begin by tinning the wires you need to solder. Here I am twisting together the cathode or positive leads of 2 LEDs. Then I apply a small dab of flux to the leads. Next I pick up the iron and touch it to the solder. This melts the solder, which sticks to the tip of the soldering iron. Next I touch the molten solder to the leads. The flux evaporates, which cools the solder and causes it to solidify on the leads. The leads are now tinned. Once you have 2 wires tinned and ready for soldering, clamp 1 wire to hold it steady. Here I'm using a clothespin, but you can also use a helping hand. Align the 2 ends you want to solder and apply a little more flux. Now pick up your iron, use it to gather another dab of solder, recheck the alignment of the 2 wires, and touch the iron to the joint. Check your connection. If it looks poorly aligned, you might be able to touch it lightly with the hot iron to rework it. This takes a light touch and a little practice. If you can't fix it, just separate the wires, realign, add more flux, and try again. When you have a good joint, tug on it lightly to be sure it's mechanically solid. Then slip a length of heat shrink tubing over the joint. Lightly brush the tubing with the side of the tip to shrink it into place. As long as your iron is not too hot, the tubing provides enough thermal insulation to keep the solder from remelting. After that, it's just like shampoo. Lather, rinse, repeat. One final word of caution. When you replace the soldering iron in its holder, do not wipe off the excess solder. That solder forms a barrier on the tip, which will keep the tip from oxidizing. Don't ask me how I learned this. If the solder does not adhere to the tip, it means your tip has become oxidized. If you look at the tip, you'll see it's a dark gray instead of a bright silver. You need to either replace the tip or you need to remove the oxidation. Do not sand the tip. It might work for a short time, but this will eventually ruin the tip. Here's a photo of some tip tinning paste, which will restore your tip. If that doesn't work, replacement tips cost less than $10. And there you have it. You are now ready to solder practically anything. The key is practice. You may feel a bit clumsy at first, but after a time, this skill will become second nature. In later videos, I'll show you some projects that will use your soldering skills. As always, I'd love to hear your comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.